Hey, I'm Alex.
I'm Val,
We're here for In at the End.
a podcast where we watch episodes of The Sopranos and then we come in here and talk about it.
Yeah, that's exactly what we're going to do.
Yeah.
And we're excited to be doing season 2. Very cool to be here.
Yeah. Even though we just finished watching season 1 like
Right.
2 days ago.
Yeah, we're just going to get right into it.
Roll right into it. But
Yeah.
we get a lot of awesome new characters that stay with us for a bit.
Yeah, I feel like they're really expanding the world in this episode.
Yeah. And not a ton of action, right? So, and I think it's an episode that's a lot about time and the passage of time. And so it is interesting to see kind of some of these themes coming back of like the mundaneness or the
fucking
regularness
of life.
Yeah. Coming into this episode and kind of setting the stage, I guess, for people who are going to be players in the season. Although, notably, there are some characters who are going to play a big role in this season who we haven't met yet.
That's right.
But, yeah, it's exciting. Here we are.
Here we are. Well, let's start. It's directed. We have Alan Coulter, which is cool to see one of our main men.
Main dudes.
coming in, and written by Jason Cahill. And yeah, exactly like you said, I agree. Like, I don't think, especially after the action that concludes season 1, we're definitely not dealing with that kind of plot development or major dramatic tension right now.
Yeah.
We're kind of just dropped into the world at a indefinite point in time that's later than where we were.
Yeah, we really have no idea how much time has passed. Again, kind of for an episode that is about time, they don't give us any kind of straightforward clues on that necessarily either. We get a montage.
Yeah. When I was 17.
Yeah. And now I forget if they start other seasons like this.
Well, we have Tony going down to the end of the driveway to pick up the newspaper,
I know
which is
we
like
have
a
that.
classic scene shot that they use at the beginning of seasons.
But do we have montages?
Oh, we'll see.
Okay.
Keep listening, and you'll find out. We'll all find out.
Yeah.
It's just we don't speak out of turn.
Which we sometimes do.
We try not to. Well, I think it's fascinating, actually, the way that the episode actually starts is they're in the securities test.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a really interesting decision that they make in this episode, where before there's any statement about the fact that it's a stock test, they wait almost 10 seconds of just nothing. That's actually how they start
the proctor's
season.
like wiping his face with a handkerchief.
He's almost just sitting there doing nothing.
He looks at his watch, right?
Everybody's just kind of sitting there doing
And that's when he's like, all right, this is this test.
Yeah.
There's a guy like jiggling his leg. Like the 10 seconds go on for a long time.
You almost don't really notice it, and it really fits, but at the same time, when you stop to think about it, that's a deliberate decision that's rather bold. If you think about how they're starting the second season, they're starting with nothing.
Yeah.
And I do think that plays into there's kind of this like nihilistic aspect to this show, where everything's kind of a big nothing is a term that we hear, from Livia, and characters kind of wrestling with this idea of what is there to life? Is it just a big nothing? And also the aspect of life being so boring and mundane, and a mob show focusing on the most trivial aspects of life for all of its characters. Yeah. So I just thought it was really interesting how that's how they started.
Well, and then we do see that kind of continue in some ways through the montage, right? I didn't jot down all the scenes that we see, right? But we definitely see, family members and mob family members in whatever they've been doing since we last saw them, right?
Yeah.
So we have a fake Christopher taking this securities test, an Asian Christopher Moltisanti. We have Syl wearing fancy shoes and trying on a suit.
Yeah.
We have Polly having sex with a stripper.
Yep.
Which is awkward. I don't really like seeing him in that. I don't know.
In that way?
I just don't see Polly like that.
Right, yeah.
We know he has some women issues that never really get talked about.
Right.
But, so we see him doing that. We see Tony having some fun as well. But then we see, Carmela cooking. We see Meadow learning to drive. We see AJ, who now takes a lot of interest in his looks. He's graduated from his mushroom cut to like the older middle schooler haircut back in the late 90s.
Yeah.
Which I was also a big fan of. I did like mushroom cuts as well, but then there was that like spiky front.
Right, spiky front.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Who I don't know. We see Melfi, right? So we see again, like she's probably like the non-family member that we see.
Yeah.
We see her working out of a motel.
Yeah. I mean, we definitely do see some fallout from the first season.
Yeah.
And we do see some development in terms of where the characters are. I mean, AJ and Meadow, that's an example of they're
progressing. Yeah.
They are progressing and maturing as they get older. But what I'm struck by in the opening montage is how everybody's kind of engaging in the same behavior. Everybody's kind of doing the same things, and I feel like people haven't necessarily matured or developed from the first season. If anything, people have maybe even kind of regressed to the most basic activity.
Yeah, as Janice says when Tony says, "You look like a teenager," she says, "My therapist says I'm regressing." And she says it with some pride, which I think is really funny and very Janice. And we'll talk about Janice in a bit.
Yeah.
But you're right. I think it's kind of like the more things change, the more things stay the same or whatever. But like things really haven't changed.
Yeah.
Everyone's still just themselves
Yeah.
in a different time period, basically. Like it's just like, it doesn't really matter in some ways where they've dropped us off.
I mean, there have been plot developments. I mean, Junior's now in prison.
Right. I love when we
see
Junior rolling down the hallway of the prison. He looks like a badass.
Yeah. But ultimately, as the show goes on, it'll be interesting to see where all these characters end up and how different will it really be. Even these developments to the characters and where they are, I mean, a lot of these things end up kind of returning to the status quo as well.
Yeah.
So the developments, as dramatic as it was in season 1, we're really finding things kind of just returning to their most basic forms.
Yeah.
And there's such a focus on time in this episode.
Yeah, huge.
And I couldn't believe how many times clocks come up. I mean, it's pretty wild, actually. So we have in the stock office, we have the clock behind Christopher, which actually I thought was great just in terms of an establishing tool.
Yeah.
Where you see him,
it's
he
like
falls
the middle
asleep,
of the afternoon.
he wakes up, you're like, wow, this has really been a lot of time. But again, the show is playing with your sense of time and how time passes. It's actually like 10:55. I'm imagining their day probably started around 9. There hasn't been that much time. And then Adriano says, oh, just leave, and he leaves. So he's clearly not at home in this environment. But the thing that I thought was really interesting is as the episode goes on, the time seems to move forward on all of the clocks.
Right.
So later on, when Christopher's talking to the manager in the office, it's more like 1 p.m.
Yeah.
And then there's some weird usages of clock. For instance, when Tony gets angry in the car and crashes, there's a billboard behind him in a very deliberate shot.
Mm-hmm.
And there's actually a clock on the ad. And it has 6:54, which is... It's very strange that they would have chosen to include a clock. They had clearly made that ad.
Yeah, I couldn't tell if it was like a clock that was built into a billboard because we do sometimes see that, but it didn't look like a real clock.
I mean, I think it's like the mural in the last episode. I think this show did have a tendency to actually build sets.
Oh, totally.
And build things to go in the background that do play into the themes that they're
definitely that billboard was built to go into it because there's also a quote on it that says, "Summit people find answers, not excuses."
Right.
And I'll talk about that maybe later.
Okay.
But I'm just saying there are some billboards in the world that have a clock on them.
Yeah.
That's all.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, actually, interesting too. When Tony's kind of pacing in his house after he finds that Janice has taken the signs, you can quickly see a shot behind him of a clock, and that actually also says the exact same time of 6:54. So. Anyway, interesting, not to get too much into it.
Yeah, I usually pay attention to clocks. I think they set clocks on purpose, right?
Yes.
So they've made some choice.
And there's a lot of them. I mean, that was, there's a lot of times where they show up, and that's not all of them.
Well, and that, maybe, are we maybe reading too much into it? It's possible, but, for me, it's the first time where we see Tony get pretty upset with Pussy when Pussy returns, right?
Yeah.
But for the first time, he seems, he's moved on from the stuff with his mom. He's happy his sister's back. And then he kind of gets stuck again, right?
Yeah.
And so that, for me, that was kind of like that. Like, you're like stuck in this anger, and you're stuck in this, like, his mood and his personality and his, you know, who he is at his core. Mm-hmm. And we could discuss, like, does Tony change throughout the series, etc., right? Like, he is kind of, like, frozen in this inescapable kind of self.
Yeah.
So,
no,
I don't know.
totally.
But maybe that's too far.
Yeah. No. Yeah, well, anyway, yeah. And I do feel like there is definitely a focus very strongly on time in this episode. Mm-hmm. And I think that this episode, more than anything else, kind of propels us forward in the world. And they're expanding it, they're developing it, they're introducing us to new characters. But it's like, not to be cliche, but it's like the more things change, the more things stay the same.
I already said that quote this episid. So.
Okay. Well, it's just so perfect.
Yeah. It's not even that perfect of a quote for this, because it's like things aren't... Anyways. But no, but there's also 2 times in this episode, because I think the time thing is definitely important, right? The musical choices indicate this to us, right? So we have When I Was 17, which is about the passage of time. And then we have Time Is On My Side at the end. Yeah. But there's 2 times in this episode, which it kind of escapes from the Sopranos' normal kind of verisimilitude and goes more into the psychological state of Tony, where we have time actually slowing down. Mm-hmm. Right? So we have time slowing down when he gets in his car crash.
Yes.
And then we have time slowing down when he's outside the backyard at his barbecue with the boys. And they're being goofballs. I don't know, like, what they're really up to, Hesh and Syl and Pussy and Polly, I guess.
Yeah.
And time slows down at that time, too. So it's playing, they're absolutely playing with our sense of time. And, and Tony's, you know, sensation of time, right?
And there's definitely some ambiguity in terms of how they deal with the passage of time. I mean, we really don't know when this is. We have a kind of general idea of how long it is, but it's very abstract. And they're not handing it to us.
No.
But it is kind of, time is kind of marching forward throughout the whole thing.
Yeah, like, we don't know how long Pussy's been gone, for example. Like, that would have been a helpful kind of positioning tool, right? But they don't give us that. They don't give us anything we want in this show.
No, you never get what you want with this show. That's okay. Makes it more fun. How about we talk about, Pussy coming back.
Sure.
About that. I thought it was interesting in terms of when he had that line, I knew I was in trouble when you came and said you were my friend.
At 3 p.m.
At 3 p.m. And I think that gets back to, I think it was in the last episode, the finale, we were talking about insincerities and lies.
And manipulation.
And at that time, I think we were talking about, in part, the use of food and kind of using that to manipulate people.
But in the episode where Tony does come to see Polly, and now I forget what episode that actually... Sorry. It's late. And we talked about how, like, he's so, like, stone cold at telling what I still believe is at the time a lie, right? But he can, like, bold-faced lie to Tony, right? And he does it again here, for any of you who've seen the show before, which I hope, if you're listening to this, that you have seen it at least once. But he isn't telling the whole truth to Tony, although it seems like he might be, right? Like, Polly checks him out. Like, we see all the guys greet Pussy as he returns, and then Polly takes Tony aside later and says, like, yeah, it all checks out. He was in Puerto Rico and at the center, right? But they're all treating him with a little bit of
skepticism.
Yeah.
And fair enough. Yeah. I just thought it was interesting, kind of the manipulation of positive behavior. Like, when he did go to visit him, he brought those cannolis. You know, this time even, like, when he at the end kind of, like, takes him back and hugs him, he goes to pat him down. Yeah. You know, Pussy says, I knew I was in trouble when you came at 3. Like,
he's making Tony feel bad.
But it's very bleak. Like, anytime Tony's engaging in positive behavior, it's typically for other means, for other ends. Mm-hmm. And the intention isn't really that positive. He's trying to manipulate, which we see that in Soprano world, and that is exactly what Livia does, and that is exactly what Janice does, and that's what we'll be seeing a lot of.
Well, they're all manipulating each other. Yeah, that's the thing. Like,
I mean, everybody is. You're right.
Pussy's manipulating Tony just as much as Tony's manipulating Pussy. Though.
Yeah, everyone's just manipulating everyone.
Yeah.
It is a very kind of bleak sociopathic worldview.
Yeah.
At least for the group of people that exist in The Sopranos.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But yeah, Anything else about Pussy we want to talk about?
Well, there's the one line where they're back at the back of Satrial's and Silvio's kind of giving his impersonations and everything.
More than we've heard Sil say ever, I think.
Yeah, it's amazing too.
They're really establishing him as more of a character this season too.
Yeah, and going back and watching the show, sometimes you take for granted who the main players are. Yeah. But in the first season, Sil and even Pussy Polly. And Polly are not given that many lines. They're not that present compared to what they will be. But it is interesting. He does have that line. It's pretty heavy-handed, actually, by the standards of The Sopranos, where he says, "Our true enemy has yet to reveal himself," and then they actually cut directly to Pussy's face laughing.
Yeah.
So, anyway, there's definitely a lot of skepticism that's built between these characters, but also for us. We're still very unsure. There's a lot of ambiguity in terms of, well, what did Pussy really do? Why did he disappear? We really don't have an answer to that.
No.
That is one of the hanging questions of the first season.
Sure.
It's one of few, because actually, for a show that revels in ambiguity, it's pretty miraculous how much they close all of their issues.
Yep.
There's very few that are left open.
There was no cliffhanger from season 1. I mean, and that's why I think it's kind of so lovely that we get this introduction to the new season that we do, right? Like, it's this kind of like, it's very establishing. There's nothing really that needs to be resolved. Except for probably this issue of Pussy, right? Like, that's the only thing that is kind of left hanging. Where's Pussy?
Yeah.
Nobody knows anything.
Yeah. No, totally. Yeah, nobody knows anything. Okay, what about the introduction of Janice?
Oh my gosh,
yeah.
Janice.
Well, it's huge.
Yeah. I'm very excited that Janice is here. It's so interesting. I mean, she's like the most annoying character. Actually, in this first episode, you're still kind of like, you're not quite into the real Janice yet.
Right.
She still has this kind of, she's Parvati, is that what she calls herself?
I think so. Yeah.
You know, like, she's wearing this hippie stuff. She's making miso soup. She, you know, outwardly, until about the end of the episode where Tony discovers that she's taken the signs off the house.
Yeah.
Like, she seems like her intentions are kind of good,
it
right?
Seems it,
like,
but then again, like, things we've talked about a lot in The Sopranos, when people have good intentions, typically there's something underneath the surface. And actually, they are very, very clear about her different behavior depending on who she's talking to.
Definitely.
And we see throughout the episode, we're kind of made privy to the fact that she has different
this other side
intentions.
Yeah. Well, and we also see, like, you know, her, I mean, poor Janice in so many ways, right? Like, if we're seeing this show through Janice's eyes, right? Like, she had the same childhood as Tony, but maybe some slightly, you know, like, maybe even worse in some ways, right? We saw her as a child last season in flashbacks. And she's been removed from this scenario. But unfortunately, we can already see hints that Janice's story is not going to be a positive one. In her first scene, there's orange juice.
Yeah.
And
never a good sign in the show.
It's never a good sign. Not to say, you know, I'm not saying anything about Janice dying, because that's not the case here, but that is that sign of, like, you know, kind of bringing death, right? Yeah. We also see when she and Tony go outside, there's this, like, wind that just is, like, blowing everything
the
around.
Tree, actually.
The umbrella, like, it's like it's blowing everything around.
Yeah, well, and especially the tree, where they've really established that symbol.
Yeah.
I mean, we've had trees shaking in the wind either immediately before or after most of the worst scenes that have happened in this show.
Yeah.
And so, if you read between the lines and kind of read the symbolism that the show has introduced as kind of their language of subtext and saying what's going to happen and what is happening, it's not a good sign for what she is.
Yeah.
And what she
well, it's
will
also
bring.
Like, not a good sign for Tony, right? Like, we see Tony, you know, saying that he's excited his sister is here, but he obviously has quite a fraught relationship with Janice, and we can see that already, right? And she's something that he has zero control over, just like Livia, right?
Yeah.
She's this kind of force of her own, and again, like, in terms of that, like, nature being things that are out of our control, she very quickly, like, goes outside of the house, for example, right? And she's smoking a cigarette, and so I think it is that, like, and we know from knowing Janice that she's never someone that Tony has any handle on at all.
Yeah. I thought actually that shot after too, it was interesting. So right after the end of that scene where they have kind of the creepy crawler.
Oh yeah, the pool cleaner.
In the pool. So I was just thinking about, because it's a very deliberate shot, and they choose to end that scene of Tony and her interacting. But there's something very kind of like insect-like about that. But it's also kind of this like spineless, moving kind of like entity. And also it's a bottom feeder. And it can also, it's unpredictable. It kind of moves in any direction. Yeah. But there is something kind of menacing, kind of gross about it. Yeah. And I think that and also the fact that it's under the water, again, another image that this show is so heavily tied to death.
Yeah, absolutely.
They are not using good symbols
no.
for Janice's first scene. No.
I do like that Tony tells her to go be Florence Nightingale. I think that's a really funny.
Right.
Again, knowing Janice, she's about the opposite of Florence Nightingale as you can get.
Yeah.
Yeah. Good. And again, I love that line where she's really proud that her therapist says she's regressing. So
right. So I was also thinking about, it's interesting, Janice as a character who comes from the Sopranos family and is like one of maybe the most Machiavellian characters we see. So sociopathic, so manipulative, and obviously influenced by the family she grew up in with Livia. Livia has almost no time in this episode.
No.
In the very beginning, we see basically where she is.
We see her in the montage,
And then we have the scene where Meadow comes. Now, that's fascinating because, again, for me, that was another example of positive behavior hiding true intentions, where Livia says, Meadow actually brings up things about her dad.
Right.
And Livia says, you do what he says, he's your father.
Right.
Which is interesting. After all the conflict and the headbutting between Livia and Tony, she actually goes out of her way to get Meadow to have a better relationship with her dad.
Interesting.
And I think she's kind of like extending her tentacles out to kind of get what she wants and manipulate Meadow kind of to have like another tool in her toolbox of manipulation. And when she then gives her grandmother's jewelry, she knows that it's going to be seen.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I'm not sure that the intentions behind that are that pure.
Right. Either. No. I never think Livia's intentions are pure.
No, I'm done with that.
Yeah. I'm over it. What else? Well, I also like, just to go back to Janice, right? Like, to see how her manipulation of Livia. So like Tony can't manipulate Livia, but Janice in some ways is able to. Like Janice is going to get what she wants first and foremost, right? Yeah, like, we'll see with the house, for example, right? Like, sure, Livia wanted to have her house back too and not be in the hospital, but Janice is getting a house out of it, and Janice has her car, right? But she says straight up to Tony, she says, or to Tony or to Barbara, she says, I have no fantasies about my mother. I forget who she says.
I think she says that to Barbara.
To Barbara.
Yeah.
And that's an interesting, I love the scenes, like we so rarely see these three soprano siblings together. We didn't even know that Barbara really existed based on the last.
Yeah. We may have,
she's a lot younger.
We may have accidentally called maybe Aunt Patty in the last episode Barbara.
Well, so maybe it's Carmela's sister. I don't know.
Anyways, apologies if we made some incredibly unimportant Sopranos trivia names for you.
But... what was I going to say about Barbara? Oh, yeah. So we see the three siblings all together, right? And, like, Tony's very affectionate to two of them. The two of them are sitting there looking at Tony saying, who does he look like? He looks like Dad, right? But they have these two extraordinarily different viewpoints on, like, life, I guess, in some ways. Barbara's obviously, like, kind of a suburban... She has this, like, handsome husband. She's got some kids, right? Versus Janice, who is wild and going to art shows and stuff like that. But even in terms of,
so wild going to art shows.
I know. She's crazy. But in terms of, like, how they talk about, like, Barbara's, like, just let Tony deal with it, right? Whereas Janice really, like, can't hold herself back from getting involved in drama, I think.
Right. Well, it's also interesting how different her story is. She's manipulating on the home. She's talking about the $180,000.
Yeah.
Before, when she was talking to Tony, she talked about, maybe I'll stay in her home for a while, like just as like a throwaway sentence. And then, when he says that she's selling it, she kind of like feigns concern, but clearly like it's affected her more deeply. It's getting in the way of her plan. But I thought that, yeah, the scene between Janice and Barbara is fascinating because we get so few windows of opportunity to see Barbara's
almost
character.
None, yeah.
And she's fascinating. I mean, first of all, just seeing her profile is so different. She looks so different.
Yeah.
She wears such different clothing.
She's so skinny compared to the other two. Yeah.
Compared to Janice and Tony. I mean, she's outside of that world.
Yeah.
She really did manage to extricate herself, which is impressive because the soprano magnetism is so strong.
Yeah.
But it is interesting because when she talks about the $180,000, she says, "You'll get your cut."
Yeah, which is such a mob way of saying things too, right?
She truly, I mean, she did grow up in that world, and she does talk about some things. I mean, I think even her and Janice, I think Janice uses the term, but being on the lam.
Yeah.
So I mean, there's like the way that they can interact is clearly influenced by the mob world, but Barbara has managed to extricate herself from it.
I wish we knew more about her.
And that's part of the story too. In the pilot, I talked about, Tony is our narrator, and I feel like everything that we see is in terms of everything we see relates to his relationships and his network. So the farther away you get from Tony and the things that he relates with, the less clear it is on the show. The more ambiguity it is, the less we know about those characters.
Yeah.
And so Barbara is quite far, even though she's blood family.
Yeah.
We're really not going to know that much about her in this show.
No.
So it's interesting to see her when you do.
But interestingly, like, she's the one that called Janice to tell Janice that Livia was in the hospital.
Yeah.
So there is some link, like Tony would have had to tell her.
Yeah.
Right? But we're not privy to that either, right? Like we know very little. It's cool.
Yeah.
On
that note, actually, of the magnetism of the soprano orbit, I wanted to talk about Tony meeting with Melfi.
Yeah.
Because, first of all, there was one thing I noticed right away, which is there was a couple edits in the episode of kind of something happening because of the mob's action, something kind of like damaging, and then cutting from the people that it impacted to the people who benefited from it. So actually, there was a very early scene.
In the montage, I think. Yeah,
in the montage where we have Melfi in the motel seeing somebody, and then it cuts to Syl wearing these fancy shoes, fancy suit, looking at himself in the mirror. So we have the impact of Tony's actions, and then we go to them and his crew benefiting from it. There was also another one in the Robistics, or not the Robistics office, in the stock office where they are pushing Robistics, and the Matthew Bevilacqua and his associate, the two new characters, these kind of like,
I don't know the other guys.
Grunt kind of, mob wannabes, and they ruthlessly throw coffee on and beat up this guy. Then they cut to a meeting with Hesh and the guy who Tony calls counselor, actually, which is kind of interesting. But they actually, Hesh and his colleague, they actually thank him for pushing Robistics.
Yeah.
So you know that these people are benefiting off of the misfortune of others.
Yeah.
So I want to look at Melfi now, because Melfi is a character who's been her life has been drastically altered from the actions of Tony and the mob. And they kind of talk about it directly. She says walking away is a choice. And she is exercising her choice right now, and she has managed to extricate herself from the mob world. Now, will that continue to last? We'll have to see. But there's obviously this magnetism to be pulled back into the orbit of the Sopranos. But there's also all of this collateral damage. She talks about her patient dying, and there's this key line that she has: how many more people have to die for your personal growth? And I think that's a very central question that this episode in particular puts out. That might even be the central question for me. I mean, I think that that's what the show is looking at, but for all of Tony Soprano's awful actions that tend to just kind of benefit him and the people in his immediate circle, there's horrible reactions for the rest of the world, and he doesn't really ever take stock of that or care.
Well, does Tony, like, out of all the terrible things that Tony has done and will do, does he ever have personal growth from those?
No, I don't think so. And that's the question too: is Tony a sociopath? Is he capable of redemption? Yeah. And that's something that this show looks at throughout its entire run. And that's what we're trying to figure out right now. But Melfi, as of right now, wants to have nothing to do with it. And it's interesting that Tony says, "I swear to Jesus Christ, nobody died because of you." That is so And she says, get out of my life.
Yeah.
So, again, she's exercising her choice, and she's succeeding right now. She's managing to, withdraw from that orbit.
Yeah.
But it's interesting because that's so similar to Tony's conversation with Artie, where he promises him, Artie, I didn't like...
Yeah, he swore on his mother.
Yeah, I swore on his mother. What's interesting about comparing it to that scene, and it's something that we talked about, we've been privy to Tony throughout that season. We know that he was responsible for lighting the place on fire. Something changed at that point. We have a different relationship with Tony as a character. We've seen him lie many times, but now we've seen him lie bold-faced about something that we've seen him do. Right? So, I swear to Jesus Christ, nobody died because of you. Well, that's also probably not really true.
Well, and even just in the context of this episode, right? Like, it's only after he kills Philly Parisi, who is the same actor who we'll later see as Patsy Parisi, his brother. But,
they're twins.
It's after he gets shot that he calls Melfi and says, it's all good now, right? Like, so there was something about him. We don't know the exact what was going to be happening. He was, like, took over Junior's crew.
He's a loudmouth, right? And the last thing he says is that, can you believe it? He was seeing a psychiatrist.
Yeah. So I guess that's just part of it.
It's
like,
bullshit.
Yeah.
I mean, there's so much bullshit from Tony.
So that guy directly did, in some ways, I guess, die because of Melfi. It was protecting Tony from the repercussions of someone, reaching out to Melfi or whatever.
Well, and as long as Melfi is involved with Tony Soprano, she will be a part of this.
Yeah.
And she will kind of be maybe not a direct accessory to these crimes, but it's impossible to extricate yourself from the violence and the killing and the misery.
And she says that she would never subject another colleague to this. We see the other psychiatrist who Tony attempts to go to, right?
The other psychiatrist who analyze this?
Right, yeah, who's wearing like a full denim outfit and cowboy boots.
Interestingly, it also seems like that office is in his house.
Right.
Which
when Melfi says that doesn't work for her or something like that.
Yeah. It's not convenient for her, to her patient at the motel.
Yeah, when she's at a motel. So we see that guy really actively making a choice, saying, like, I've seen the news. I know who you are. I'm choosing not to get involved.
Yeah.
Right?
He says, I don't need the ramifications.
Melfi, even though, she is, like, stating that she wants Tony out of her life, she's already in.
Yeah.
And we have Syl doing his famous, just when I thought I was out, they pull me back in, right? Like, you're never out. You're never out. And so you have to, from the very beginning, make that choice. We see a couple references to stuff like that, right? We hear a conversation between Carmela and her mother.
Yeah.
And again, I love Carmela's parents a lot. But we hear about a conversation, right, that Livia had with Carmela on their wedding day, saying it's a bad decision. He's going to get sick of you, basically, right? So at that point, Carmela still had a choice, right?
Yeah.
Now Carmela can never extricate herself from this, right? So I think that's a big, as soon as you get yourself the least bit involved, like even these guys in the stock office and stuff like that, like their choices, their free will, if you want to put it that way, is limited because they've made that decision and you can't go back.
Yeah. And those and they do talk about two people left the office.
Yeah.
So that's an interesting choice, and probably the right choice.
Yeah.
I mean, from everything we've seen, I think saying "get out of my life" is the best thing you could possibly say.
In terms of like the episode title, right? Guy walks into a psychiatrist's office. I don't know. I'm kind of struggling with my interpretation of it. I think one of the ways that I'm kind of looking at it is that these, like therapeutic environments or something like that, like they could really be anywhere. So like, Tony and Melfi sitting in the cafe. He's in this other psychiatrist's home. Melfi's in her motel room, right? Like, you're always kind of exposing yourself, out in the world, and we see this, like we see Tony's psychological state is like worn on his sleeve, really, right? Like he doesn't have to go into a psychiatrist's office for people to know that there's something wrong with him. Carmela knows that there's something up with Tony, and she keeps hounding him, like, when are you going back to psychiatry, right? And we see that in the driving sequence, right? Like we cut from a scene where he says to Carmela, like, oh, I've been good, like everything's great.
Yeah.
And he's in the car and he's like happily dancing to Smoke on the Water, right?
Yeah.
Until it starts to skip, which those of you who had CDs, like, that happens,
yeah.
you know? And that's okay. But he gets so angry and
so angry, yeah.
that he can't help but pass out, right?
Yeah.
Like, it's just like such an overwhelming feeling.
One thing that's actually interesting about that is as he's driving, there's this loud rock music. We see a bridge in the background as he's driving very quickly. And again, you know, establishing something probably not good is coming.
Yeah.
But one thing that's interesting, I was talking about clocks earlier. When he gets so angry and then he crashes the car, then we see the clock saying 6:54. The only other time he gets that angry in the episode is after he finds that Janice took the signs.
Right. And
then he's pacing, equally angry,
Yeah.
kind of reaching that level. That's actually when we see the clock also saying 6:54. So there's kind of like a link between those two moments of anger.
Yeah.
Which I found kind of interesting.
Totally. And then, like I mentioned before, we have that sign with the clock on it that says, Summit people find answers, not excuses, right? So, you know, the goal of therapy is to find answers, not excuses for your behavior. And so I thought that was, and Tony's forever finding excuses, right? Like, that he is mad because Smoke on the Water was skipping, you know, like he has a lot of trouble taking ownership over his psychological state and over his feelings and over, like, you know, who he is, basically.
Yeah. Also, one thing about that ad too, it almost looked like it was referencing the office, the stock office.
It looked like it was a bank. It was an ad for Citizen Bank or something like that.
Yeah.
It said. Yeah.
The way that it was put together, though, it looked like almost like actually like one of the mob wannabes, kind of like behind the desk.
Totally.
Yeah.
Totally.
There's just kind of connections everywhere.
Yeah.
But it is interesting, the title, you know, because it's very little time in the episode spent in the psychiatrist's office. Actually, it's just that one scene where Tony walks in.
And that's his house.
Right. So actually, well, it probably, it does.
It's his home office.
It seemed
like it. It looks like a house.
It looks like it, yeah.
It's very orange.
But I mean, you know, that's also like a setup to a joke.
Yeah.
You know, and also that scene is great just in terms of it's like classic Sopranos. I mean, that's like a funny scene in terms of him saying that he's seen analyze this. It's so preposterous, oversimplified.
Yeah.
But it's also kind of getting to his removal from that world and not kind of wanting to be involved in the ramifications. Mm-hmm. Even if it is overly simplified, it's probably the best thing he probably could have thought. As stupid as it is. Yeah. And it's also like an example of the show kind of using humor to...
Yeah. Well, there were a lot of kind of jokes in this
Yeah.
episode, right? Like Pussy says to Tony, like, you really overdo it with this
the jokey,
jokester stuff. We have Syl doing his bit.
Yeah.
Like, the guys are all laughing.
Over and over.
The guys were doing that silly dance at the barbecue. We have, I mean, it's not really a joke, but I do like the Asian Christopher Moltisanti taking the exam. So it's kind of, it is like, is this all just a setup to one big nothing or a joke, right? Like, we feel like there should be progress happening, but
what do we have?
Here we are. We're still stuck.
We have people joking around doing the same horrible shit.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, it's interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah, and his psychological issues getting worse. No means to address them. Yeah. The other thing I wanted to talk about was the last scene.
Yeah.
And I think it kind of links to that very first scene. The show's always bookending things and having kind of duality in terms of what it'll put in an episode, I find. Mm-hmm. Like, they'll use a symbol twice, or there's something that'll kind of reappear. But the fact that the first scene is that 10 seconds of silence and nothingness.
And then we have a lot of seconds of silence at the end.
Well, yeah, and what happens is he comes home, Carmela, what are you doing home at this hour? Tony, nothing. I thought that was actually really interesting. He's doing nothing. And the fact
it's also a reference to time.
But it's also interesting that this show and that this episode is concluding the first episode of the new season with nothing happening. You all right? Yeah. Not addressed. Let's just leave it there.
Yeah.
She microwaved some pasta. Then, very interesting, the soundtrack, we have nature sounds. Almost, if not identical, to the scenes we have when Mikey P was getting killed. Signifying the eternal kind of thing.
Yeah.
And we actually have, in that scene, there's greenery behind Carmela and Tony. And there's actually a lot of other scenes. There's a scene where Tony meets with Melfi. There's greenery behind the highway, behind the glass, which is actually, that's almost identical to the scene where Tony,
They're
I think, was
outside
talking
the
to
Bing.
Syl
Yeah.
outside the Bing in the back, looking at the greeneries behind
I'm glad I
the,
can read your
the
mind
highway.
about what you're thinking
It's good.
of.
Yeah.
That's good.
But there is this kind of like eternal behind them looming in the distance that we see and has been established throughout the whole show. But we have these nature sounds and these kind of like eternal symbols, and they're doing nothing. He's eating pasta. Carmel's going through some magazines. They're not addressing their problems.
Yeah.
And that's where we're left off. And that's what I think this episode's about.
I also love the part of them in the montage where Tony sneaks in after being with Irina, takes off his clothes, whatever, gets into bed, and then he's looking at the back of Carmela's head, and then she turns over, and they just kind of like, they both look at each other in the face, and then she turns back over. Yeah. It's a really good scene.
Yeah.
I just have a couple other little things. It's a color question for you, actually.
Ooh, I was just leaving it out there. I've been talking about color so much.
We don't need to get too much into it, but a lot of the women in this episode, except for maybe Barbara.
Yes.
Because even Meadow.
I think she's wearing all white.
She's wearing all white, kind of beigey white. But a lot of the women were wearing this kind of like reddish salmon color at different times. Carmela's mom, Carmela herself, Adriana, Janice, they were all wearing this kind of like pinkish red. So, I don't know. I just wanted to point it out.
One thing that in terms of that, I'd have to think about it for all of the women. But one thing that I thought that was interesting was the color scheme is very black and white, very monochromatic in the beginning. There's tons of... I mean, when Tony and Pussy go down to the basement, basically everything's white or black. People are wearing all whites, all blacks. Pussy's wearing black pants, white shirt. Yeah. Tony takes off his white tank top, throws it in the dryer. Yeah. Or the wash, not the dryer. That would be dumb. Melfi's wearing all black at the motel.
I don't think we've ever seen her wear all
That's
black.
Rare. Yeah. All black.
She's
You have black phone. Typically, we're seeing the black phone that we've seen before. Sometimes a white phone in the... Sopranos household. Now, what's interesting is Janice's first scene, she's wearing that red. Mm-hmm.
Then she wears purple later.
Yeah. The only thing I was thinking about with the red is it's actually a very similar color to what Artie was wearing when he goes to the church to talk to Father Phil, and he's dealing with his anger that's kind of out of control. It did cross my mind that there was kind of some... link there that she's anyway.
At one point, Adriana is wearing a full outfit of that color. It's like a matching pants and shirt. Carmela's wearing it. Anyways, it just
part of it for me, I find like the
women are angry.
Well, and maybe it's not even anger, but it's more complicated emotions and a more complicated worldview than reducing things to right and wrong, black and white. Yeah. And we see blacks and whites, sometimes grays, but color is typically like a more well-rounded worldview and seeing things beyond the mob world and these kind of like immediate needs for closure and understanding of the issues that are arising. And I think the women in this show have a greater understanding of that. Yeah. Characters like Charmaine, who's often wearing very vibrant colors.
Well, and in this episode, right, like if we can take it this far, right, Melfi's wearing all black. She has made up her mind on one end. Like, she's not even looking to hear Tony out. Yeah. Right? Like, she is black. Yeah. On this issue. Yeah. Anyways, I thought it was. I just wanted to bring it up to you because I know you like that shit. And then the other thing, it's like more of a sad thing, and I mean the story gets sadder as we go on. But one of the first scene we see of Christopher outside of the montage, he's snorting coke at 10:50 in the morning or whatever. And then unfortunately we find out later, based on something Adriana says, that he's also using harder drugs, right? Because he leaves on her gas on her stove, and she's like, why can't you cook your shit with a lighter like everyone else, right? So he's cooking something else, unfortunately. Right. Yeah.
Oh, so perceptive. I actually didn't get that.
Yeah, like we don't see him using, I mean, we will, but
good drug knowledge.
Thanks. What I bring to the table. So unfortunately, like, we start to see, and we see him like watching films really intensely. Oh no, actually we do see him snorting coke in the montage. What am I talking about? It's when he's watching that film. Yeah. Anyways.
Yeah. 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 Well, let's see what happens to Christopher. Maybe he'll do great. Yeah. Yeah. Just keep watching, guys. Yeah. The only thing I want to talk about was the song choice at the end. Mm-hmm. And again, we have When I Was 17 talking about the passage of time throughout somebody's life. And at the end, this song, Time is on my side. Some of the lyrics I thought were really interesting. Do everything your heart desires. Just remember I'll still be around. And then sometime you're going to come back. And I thought that is a kind of a central element. You know, Tony and the people around him are often doing exactly what they want without thinking of the ramifications. Carmela will still be around, and that last scene is
Melfi will still be around.
Well, we'll see, but you know, a lot of these people trying to curb your spoilering.
Hey, you said Carmela's still going to be around.
Yeah, well, we'll see. Maybe I'm wrong. maybe I didn't remember correctly.
Yeah.
But these characters are around in that last scene.
Yeah.
You know, where he returns. You know, he does come back to that house of domesticity.
Yeah.
He does come back to that mundane life.
Yeah.
And I think that is a really key part of this episode.
Just when they thought I was out, they pulled me back in.
Yep. Well, that's it. That's where we leave
Good
it.
One. Okay, cool. Well, looking forward to season 2.
Yeah.
And
looking forward to all the great things Janice is going to do.
Yep.
All the great things maybe some new characters are going to do.
Yeah.
And we look forward to talking about it, and hope you're enjoying, and we'll see you next time.